has always loved telling and hearing stories about heroes. We love the allure of greatness and glory, especially when the recipient of that glory is someone who you would never have expected to receive it. A squire takes up arms after his knight falls and goes on to save the kingdom from darkness. The nephew of a moisture farmer finds out he is the chosen one and leaves his home after tragedy strikes, discovers a long lineage of power, and embarks on a universe-spanning quest to thwart the threat of intergalactic tyranny. Space Nazis. A peace-loving halfling from a largely ignored race leaves the comfort of their utopia to join the other races of the world to destroy an object of extreme corruption, their size literally setting them at a disadvantage on their journey. A young wizard boy. Well, you get the idea. The hero's journey, lowercase, has been around for centuries, but many of these ideas were collected by anthropologist Joseph Campbell in his monomyth. Campbell, like many of us, was fascinated by these stories and the power they have on us. Heroes often go on a literal journey, but this specific journey happens in the mind of the hero, taking place in tandem with the traversal of a physical landscape, one that motivates them, forms them, and makes them the hero we love to hear about. A lot of tabletop games let you take on the role of a would-be adventurer, but not many of them do so from a distance. Call to Adventure does that, and it's obvious that it's inspired by Campbell's work. So let's talk about it. You are a storyteller, recounting the events of a hero's life instead of the hero himself. The game tasks you with forming the hero's journey, almost in retrospect, as the hero reflects on his life. I will say that this isn't entirely true. One could say that the story is formed as it is taking place, but to me it feels like a look back, because this game is so unique in its presentation and goals. You set out to get from the origin of your hero to their destiny, and you do not do so by slaying monsters with dice rolls in combat or exploring dungeons and finding a magical artifact, but by simply laying out a narrative, which is presented in beautifully illustrated cards. No miniatures or action selections here. Call to Adventure is not only the formative starting point in Campbell's presentation of the hero's journey, but it's a card game of story, conflict, daring feats, and ultimate fates. If you are familiar at all with heroes and their legends, you will begin a Call to Adventure in a familiar place. The origin cards are not only where you, the player, begins your story, but your hero starts here as well. Most of these origins are the humble beginning you would expect: a beggar raised on the streets, a performer eking out a living with a group of fellow troubadours, or maybe you're a noble ill-content to stay within the confines of a life of privilege. The artwork in Call to Adventure really shines here, and is one of the best parts about it. Each portrait on your origin card evoking the situation you begin the game in is beautiful. You can't help but recall the stories you know and love with similar starting points. For example, the Outlander card reminds me of the beginning of the modern video game Horizon Zero Dawn, in which Aloy leaves the life she knew to find the wider world within the walls of other civilizations, past and present. The Apprentice card makes me think of Will Turner, the humble blacksmith second in the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise, who goes on to become a legendary pirate. And here is one of the best things about a Call to Adventure. It is general enough to feel familiar even if you've never played it. The story you tell in the game is one you know and appreciate because it is so similar to a story you already love. As you set up the game, you will also pick a motivation, an event that drives your hero forward, and a destiny, the fated outcome of your hero. This destiny is kept secret from other players, known only to you until the end of the game. Once you pick those cards and put them on your player board, you will also set out these 3 decks of cards in the main play area. Each deck represents an act that your hero will go through, and as you can see, they kind of mirror the spaces on your player board. Now, once you reach the end of Act 3, then the game is over. As you develop your hero's journey in Call to Adventure, you do so by taking a couple of actions on your turn. The first you can do is to take a trait. If the row of cards from the act that you are currently in contains one of these cards, you can claim it if you meet the requirements to do so. These requirements are anything from pain and experience, which you should have as you start the game with 3, to discarding a hero card, which you should also have towards the beginning of the game. The other card type you will face in an act of Call to Adventure is a challenge. These cards are a bit more complicated. Each challenge will contain a number of symbols and a value you have to meet in order to complete it. You test yourself against the challenge by casting runes. Each player has access to starting runes, which, let's be honest, are like dice that got squished. To succeed a test, you have to match or exceed the number on the challenge card. This symbol is success, and the blank side means you've wasted your turn and your hero should probably just give up this whole adventuring thing. If you're feeling particularly gutsy, you can also take on an alternate path on the challenge card, which is often more difficult, requiring you to roll higher, or cast higher, or flick higher. You get the idea. Not only do these two paths diverge numerically, they often have flavor texts which tend to line up with a light and dark side as well. More on this later. Rewards for these challenges are listed on the corresponding card path. As you acquire traits and complete challenges, their cards are added to your hero's journey. If you have a rune symbol present on your player board, you can add a rune of that type if it is a part of the challenge card. The different runes correspond to abilities your hero develops over their journey. They include those you might find in an RPG. Not only do you have core runes and ability runes at your disposal, but you can also spend some experience and add dark runes for every point you spend. Adding these increases your likelihood of success to then acquire more runes and become more and more powerful. You can begin to see the game's arc here. Get runes, use runes to get runes, and so on and so forth. There's a decent amount of depth here, mainly created by the options you have on your path to completing the story of your hero and winning Call to Adventure. Not only do you want to acquire new cards that make you more powerful, but cards also have a number of symbols that increase your score at the end of the game. These story icons stack and are worth more points, and the more of them you have in your story. Apart from these icons, there are also these icons for you to keep track of. I have to admit that it took me a minute to remember all of the iconography in this game. Many games have a wide range of symbols, but for whatever reason these struck me as too similar to keep straight at the start of the experience. I had to check the scoring legend a few different times to see what particular symbols indicated what as I acquired cards and scored the game. Anyway, these particular icons indicate a change on the light and dark track. On the player board, you'll see this track here. It serves as Call to Adventure's morality system, an indicator as to whether or not your hero has a halo or devil horns on your head. As you can see, there are different rewards and consequences for the actions you take on your turn. See, not only can you be a hero, but you can be an anti-hero. I found myself having a bit of a philosophical crisis about the name of the game and the fact that you can be an anti-hero. Can an evil character have adventure? Is that something reserved for those who do good? Robin Hood is an anti-hero, but he technically does good, right? Has adventures. Does Darth Vader have adventures? Maybe. Does being an anti-hero mean you are evil or just mischievous? Star-Lord is an anti-hero, for sure. He does a bit of bad, a bit of good, but he isn't evil. I mean, Indiana Jones is a tomb robber, but he definitely has adventures, right? Does that mean he has adventures? Or since he wants to save relics for a museum, that he's actually doing good? Anyway, this is perhaps a subject for another video. Your placement on this Traco morality dictates not only what your rewards might be at game end, but what particular actions you can take on challenge cards. So even if you struggle with being an anti-hero from a moral standpoint, the sacrifice may be worth it if winning is the most important thing to you. And therein lies an interesting discussion to spend some time on. Call to Adventure sits in this strange realm that a lot of storytelling games sit in, and that is, it can be many different things to many different players. Now, at the end of the game, People are encouraged to recount the story of their hero. Look back over your cards and fill in the gaps of what's going on. So there's something here, an interesting activity for someone who's not necessarily looking for a greatly competitive experience. Are you in love with storytelling? Well, there is a compelling process here for you. Do you want a deeply competitive experience? Well, that can be here too. But as is the case with games that try to do a lot of different things, you realize that they always run the risk of doing nothing well. Now, I'm not sure I'm willing to make such broad claims in either directions, but I will say that I think the game may have been stronger if it picked one lane to drive in, a competitive game or a storytelling activity. Gaming has had this obsession with storytelling in the last few years, so I don't see this complication going away anytime soon. As another example, take one of Ryan Laukatt's storytelling games. At the end of my first playthrough of Near and Far, I remember thinking that I wanted to go out on adventures more, and yet I felt torn to stay in town and build out my resource collections to try and get more points by claiming more artifacts. And well, you get the idea. There's always a push and pull between going all in on crafting the most compelling story and focusing on the game. And there has to be, right? Because for every rule set placed on an activity like storytelling, it always has to have more in common with an activity than a game. How can it not? Stories mean something different to each person, and story is nearly impossible to judge objectively without a clearly defined group of parameters. Yes, there are competitions for writing and storytelling, but you wouldn't call those games, and you would certainly not be able to have the sort of depth you'll find in those types of competitions in a 30-minute game. That being the case, you'd have to add some sort of secondary subset to storytelling activities, and the push and pull continues. You will take turns with other characters, completing challenges and gaining traits for each of the 3 rounds of the game until one player has completed their story. Call to Adventure sits in a strange place. It has a couple of things it tries to be in its card collecting game and storytelling activity. And on the game side of things, it takes a small step above filler game to be more appealing to people who like deeper games. There's a subjectively simple number of choices to make on your turn, but a level of depth that may be surprising at first glance. Forgetting the luck aspect created by a deck of cards and rolling dice-like binary runes, you can really get caught up in what choices to make. Do you go all in on a particular story icon? Do you risk the evil side of your morality track for instant aid that may hurt you in the long run? Or do you just allow Call to Adventure to control you and your hero's fate, letting it just play out and tell your hero's story just the way life can be an unpredictable series of events that just seem as random? That randomness creates a lot of drama as well, which is common in these instances. Having a card pop up in the available row that you've been waiting for is so incredible, while on the flip side, having it taken away from you or failing a test to acquire it is heartbreaking. Do you remember when I mentioned that Call to Adventure seems so familiar? I spoke of that of being a strength in the game, but it is perhaps a bit double-sided. It feels familiar because your hero could be any hero. The story you're telling is skeletal, and so your hero is as well. There is no meat on those bones. Let me leave this mildly disturbing metaphor and tell you more of what I mean. But first, some more background. The hero's journey, as Campbell describes it, sees a hero venture forth from the world of common day into a region of supernatural wonder. Fabulous forces are there encountered, and a decisive victory is won. The hero comes back from this mysterious adventure with the power to bestow boons on his fellow man. This quote comes from the introduction of Campbell's work on comparative mythology, The Hero with 1,000 Faces. It goes into details on the monomyth, myths that share similarities across cultures. And although I shared a quote, I think the name of his work says it all. This hero that you create in a Call to Adventure could be anyone, one with many faces. The downside of this is that it becomes a less personal story. Think for a moment about my previous video and its subject, Runebound. I love what this game does in giving you not just an arc, but details, meat on the bones. Sorry, I lied about that creepy metaphor being done. Small details and detours that make it a more fleshed out experience. The downside, of course, being that it takes much longer as a gaming experience, but more on that in my conclusion. I don't want to be too critical here, since there is a lot to like about Call to Adventure. So to return to things that it does well, let's look to Campbell again and see what he might have us believe about art. Pathways to Bliss, Mythology and Personal Transformation is a book compiling Campbell's later lectures and workshops. He says about artists and the monomyth, artists are magical helpers, evoking symbols and motifs that connect us to our deeper selves. They can help us along the heroic journey of our own lives. The artist is meant to put the objects of this world together in such a way that through them you will experience that light, that radiance, which is the light of our consciousness, and which all things both hide and, when properly looked upon, reveal. The hero's journey is one of the universal patterns through which that radiance shows brightly. What I think is that a good life is one hero journey after another. Over and over again, you are called to the realm of adventure. You are called to new horizons. Each time there is the same problem. Do I dare? And then if you do dare, the dangers are there and the help also. The fulfillment or the fiasco, there's always the possibility of a fiasco. But there's also the possibility of bliss. I love this quote because it tells us as listeners how to see what Campbell and in turn each storyteller of old sees in the hero's journey. The artists of the world illustrate the stories with vibrancy and passion. So too, the artists who have collaborated on the game allow us to perhaps live a fuller life. One Campbell might say, put the objects of this hero's world together. I cannot say enough good things about the art in Call to Adventure. As I said when I briefly mentioned the card art before, each card is evocative and detailed, creating a scene you want to take in and stare at. It's really a shame that you're supposed to tuck these cards away on your playmat. I want to see them more. Okay, perhaps a house rule is in order. I have to be perfectly honest and say that I like what Call to Adventure represents more than I like the game itself. I would much rather play a game that lets you play out these daring moments of a hero's life than to breeze past them in a fleeting moment on the way to a dramatic conclusion. It may help you get a better grade as you cram for the exam, but the cliff notes of a story are a lot less interesting than the full version. That being said, if you don't have the time to sink into a large, exploration-heavy game like Runebound or Descent, and the shortened version is what you want, then I highly suggest that you check out Call to Adventure, a brief and somewhat simple game that lets you live a lifetime per playthrough. It may just scratch the itch you feel to live your own heroic feats until you can do it yourself.